Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. Today's episode represents part two of a topic that I started off last week, which was looking at sort of practical conundrums that coaches face just in the actual doing of coaching, really at the coal face of our practice, and we're trying to get through a training session or we're trying to navigate a match day environment and how that has an impact on our coaching behaviours, specifically as they relate to, the motivational behaviours that are seen in our practice. And last week rather, I looked at, the sort of role and the place and the timing of competition is just one of the sort of training modalities that coaches try and work with or work within, sometimes work around and, leverage different things. But so I'm going to kind of change track a little bit. We're not going to talk about competition this week, but we're going to be talking about other sort of everyday sort of problems that coaches face, specifically looking at things like just the time constraints coaches sometimes feel under, looking at coaches' feelings on when's the best suited time to actually engage in particular behaviours, which is to sort of show the sort of value laden element of motivational behaviour. Even actually looking at the influence of the physical environment, and if anyone that's maybe listened to the podcast already will know, with my sort of research area being specifically looking at influences in coach behaviour, I don't really take the view that, there's a real binary way in which we should be coaching and that, a ton of support is always good and control is always bad and all these things. Coaching's very context specific, very situation based. Coaches do things for a combination of logistical factors, just because it's like, how can we actually get that going, alongside situational constraints insofar as, well, yeah, I want to do this, but the situation requires this. But often also operating under emotional duress at times, and that sometimes is carried forward from the situation that we're in. That is also, one of the factors that influences our behaviour. And then there's also sometimes, underlying all of those, probably, I would argue, is the philosophical side of our decision making. Because I think when the going gets tough in coaching, only the most deeply held values sort of survive, or at least only the most deeply held values, or at least, stay in the game somewhat in terms of the coach thinking towards them, or there are certainly some values that are written on paper but are really in practice fairly expendable. And I think autonomy is one such potential victim of that conundrum, where we want to do things but only in very idealized, often absent spaces, in these sort of pockets of time where it exists, if it ever does exist, where it's just very easy to do things that are tough. They are a dichotomy of words, deliberately so. It's almost a juxtaposition of, things that, don't maybe quite happen that naturally. So that's why I say that. So coaches have a tough time, and this is, as I say, isn't a coach bash. I think what we're going to do today is talk through some of the findings from my PhD research that I think has also been supported from previous work. Consider where, do you know what? No wonder the coach didn't, do this and is a bit more controlling here, but also maybe to play devil's advocate here in certain times as well, about, well, when this happens, then we've got this tendency to lean further away from autonomous support or from competence support or relatedness support, but recognise that comes at a cost, or recognise that maybe we didn't need to do that. Maybe there's a middle ground there somewhere. So I want to kind of just speak through some of these findings, and as you listen, try and see where you can find yourself in them. Maybe in a situation you've experienced, in a similar sort of practical running of coaching, type situation that you think isn't maybe quite captured here, but has relevance, maybe distally to, something you've experienced yourself. So that's what we're going to get into. Before we do, I just want to give a quick update. Again, the usual palaver of saying, if you are new to the podcast, welcome, and and I don't mean to put such a monotone onto that. I actually do definitely welcome. Please subscribe to the show and rate it highly, just to help with visibility, and share it widely as much as you can. And the same goes for quite a committed listener base. But actually, it's quite interesting to find that actually, of those, when you look at some analytics that are watching and listening regularly, that you aren't actually subscribed, strange enough. So please try and subscribe if you can. But that's all I'll say on that for this week. Another little quick update I was just wanted to bring to your attention is, this may only apply to some of the audience that are listening, because I know not all of them are academics, which is great, which I absolutely love. But there is a lot of academics out there who maybe are listening maybe have thought about starting a podcast yourself. And quite recently, I actually published an article for Times Higher Education on the very topic of podcasting for academics, and how actually academics can adopt a podcaster's mindset to help their everyday work, even if actually they don't want to go and launch a podcast. But there is some stuff in there that does speak a little bit to the benefits of that. So I'm going to put it in the show notes just for anyone that's interested. And I just want to put out there as well that I'm actually quite keen to work with people who maybe want a bit of support in this sort of space. Maybe they are academics and they want to get going. There was a bit of a mental hurdle they're trying to go over to do that, because it's quite unnerving sometimes to people doing these sorts of things. I totally get it. And I've experienced as much of that myself. And likewise, just not being an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, just from being in the trenches a little bit, and having done this now for over a year, there's some bits of experience and sort of lessons to avoid having to fell into, and actually some good practice as well that I think I'm quite keen to pass on to other people. So any academics, or even teams of academics, divisions across different institutions, maybe would like me to chat to you guys, and maybe we would do a workshop or something like that. Just put it out there, just get in touch. Okay, so I digress. So let's start, as I say, on the one of the first sort of typical things that I have found from my own personal research, my own personal experience as well, being a coach, an imperfect coach as well, and also just being a coach who understands that coaching's bloody tough and we can't always fit everything into one single place and one single time, is the the idea of when is it of picking sensible moments, to the most obvious way. I think just out of all the three psychological needs, I think autonomy supportive strategies tend to be the least convenient, at least for those that are just starting out in this game and trying to kind of get better at it. So, or those that maybe haven't really given a lot of thought to it in a deep sense, maybe because, as I say, it's not maybe on the radar as being something really important. We'll come back to that. But there is a bit of a tendency that when it comes to giving players input, when it comes to giving them sort of decision making opportunities, that we tend to reserve them for more superficial parts of a practice, or even actually more superficial parts of a season. So I think all of us are probably, I don't say guilty, but I will, just for the purpose of this, just to keep the momentum going with it. Here's the warm up. In the warm up, who wants to give me a trick, or who wants to choose what we do? And like, it's not that isn't still good, because that you really are showing that you're giving that opportunity away. But I think it's a case of, how is it received? What does it one communicate to players about where you feel control needs to be held? And look, in some spaces it might come players aren't even all conscious of the fact that they should be given more control. In other spaces, perhaps if you're working with older athletes, who it's sort of part of the developmental curve, they actually tend to move towards a place where they want more freedom and independence. That can signal a bit of a false care towards that. It can feel quite disingenuous. It also sort of speaks a little bit to um, what you actually think about the role of autonomy, and whether or not you see it as something that should be targeted at the core of your practice, or is more of a luxury item that sits more on its periphery. And how this sort of fits, I suppose, with prior practice and also prior research. We have actually found, definitely, there's been some longitudinal assessments of the coach-created motivational environment where autonomous supportive conditions have actually been shown to be quite stable across sort of periods of training. There's some work by Addy and colleagues in 2012, and also I think it's Stenlin and Lindo in 2015 that found that. I've also sort of seen, by comparison, autonomy support heightened. It's sort of been observed to be heightened in the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks of a period of a season in university students. That was some research in 2006 by Rainbow and Duda as such. I mean, there's also been accounts, not so much placed within a, you know, motivational psychology sphere or anything to do with self-determination theory specifically, but there was a study, I think, by Ben Bengoeche et al. Sorry, I butchered the name there. And I actually found that a lot of coaches, in terms of how they perceive when to do, what sort of practices they perceive to do during non-competitive periods, it tends to be the ones that are more fun. And I suppose I kind of liken that with ones that are more to do with like the actual engagement of the group with one another, with the coaches, i.e., sort of relating the supportive structures at play there. So there does tend to be this sort of bracketing of what we would determine as being needs, really core needs, but what other coaches would see as being maybe more wants, and therefore, not necessarily what absolutely athletes require. So, and that's where it's like, well, and I go back to this is where there's an interplay, and anyone that's maybe listened to before, you'll know that I also sort of think antecedent, certainly I believe in the antecedent factors play on one another. So what we sometimes see here is, in this is particular example, is the interaction of a coach's personal orientation towards coach control or towards athlete control, an interaction between that and the activity type itself. So activity type is clearly an influencing factor on as to whether or not we often would prescribe or whether or not we facilitate and offer opportunities for athlete input and these sorts of things. So it's one of those ones to consider straight out the traps, in terms of how that how that sort of figures with your own practice, and is it something you've really thought about? So that is something that really does matter, and I think it's the issue as well is another thing that I see is where it does appear is it's almost sort of comes through just osmosis, and it's sort of a lot of coaches and certainly coaches I've interviewed as well and observed that they almost find they actually speak quite positively about opportunities where they have given autonomy, but it's sort of serendipitous. So just the moment allowed for it. So they went, oh yeah, we just, we made the most of it because it was this little thing that's happening. And it just, and it comes back to that sort of like all these, about the sort of tendency for coaches to just believe that we should do it when all these other factors come together and when the jigsaw seems complete, which is very far and few between. And the issue about serendipity is that it goes against deliberate practice. And for any coach out there listening, I'm sure you're aware as well that, the best way to get better is to do something actively and to reflect on it. And the problem, therefore, where we only reserve autonomy as one example, it could be also elements of competence support or related to support for that matter. When we reserve them to only periods where it's really ideal or things just emerge and and it's very unintentional, even if in the moment we intend on it and we are very intentional in the moment, but if it's not pre-planned, then it clearly won't form a large, if any, part of your reflection after the session, and therefore the attention that you give towards actually carrying forward that reflection into further sessions so you get better at it. So I mean, I've always been an advocate of the idea that you should get good at something before you judge it, and I think where we see the interplay again with coaches maybe not feeling like autonomy matters much. Well, are you even given it any time to flesh out and time to get better at it and reflect on it in order to sort of at the very least back up that, at the very least offer an audit trail for that opinion. I think that sort of is where we get into this sort of swamp of ideas and beliefs, and how that sort of can sometimes unfairly push down good behaviours like autonomous supportive strategies and coaching. There's a few things happening there at once. So again, I was just ask you as a coach to consider that. That if you are unsure about it and you are a bit of a critic, as I am, of being autonomous supportive, are you preemptively reserving it for superficial spaces, if any spaces, and is that in itself creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy whereby you where or if you even do at any point give it any breathing room and you do act in an autonomous support manner in very small intervals of time, is that enough that to really sort of then compel you to reflect on it deeply enough that you then actually make it part of the plan A and not just this sort of if and when and sort of ad hoc sort of where it's required, but also hopefully where it's not required and all those sorts of things. So just think a little bit about that. I think that's something that does come into where we're overly conservative in the place in the spaces that we can use to fulfill that need for autonomy or that need for competence overtly or that need for relatedness overtly. I've had previous conversations on the show, even with like David Baird, for example. There's an episode we've done about reprioritising fun within coaching, and that's just one that's a related example, I think, to this, where it's seen often fun seen as a luxury item. We have fun nights. So like, some of the older research as well that's sort of talking about coaches' perception of how they act in these sort of non-competitive phases of training or non-competitive phases of a season. It does start, I think I see a lot of crossover between that and how coaches talk around when they actually give athlete input into decisions. It tends to still be in these sort of same phase at the micro level of a session, or higher order stuff more of the season and how the season's going and stuff like that. So something to think about. I don't think we should be reserving it for superficial moments. The other thing that coaches, and I've heard coaches and I've felt this myself, is time pressure. Okay, so actually, how much time do you have, and how much pressure do you feel within that time to complete the things that you set? So typically what I've found is that when coaches don't feel that they have a lot of time, so they have a perceived sort of feeling of time pressure, they feel that they're under time constraints. The impact that has on the motivational environment they create is that interpersonal behaviours get sort of diminished by the need to get through content. So I've had previous episodes where I talk a lot about the obsession around content and coaching, and the sort of that seeing coaching as nothing but the task. And therefore, if we see that, then we almost sort of want to fill our sessions with things, with content. And when we're under time pressure, then we really care about getting through the content. So we're often the interpersonal side of coaching fails, and as a result of that is that we start giving less rationale for our instructions. So we stop explaining things as much, if at all. We maybe don't offer that much input from the athlete side of things in its various sort of oaks, if you will, because we can offer input to an athlete in terms of just how they feel and trying to acknowledge their feelings, or it could be actually a choice of activity. The choice of activity is often actually used as a bit of I don't mean to say excuse, but I will range just to make this point obvious. Sometimes I use a bit of an excuse or a cop out that, I can't, and I've literally heard coaches say this in their own words, I can't necessarily put together like 5 or different separate practices, and let the athletes decide of which one to do. We've not got enough time, we're trying to get through things and stuff like that. And I say, you don't need to go to that radical extreme. There is softer ways of giving input, as I say. It might even just be offering opportunities for independent practice is almost it's part of that as well. So that tends to go down a little bit. I've also seen sort of like more detailed instructions and expectations of the task itself, whether that be demonstrations or whether that be just, it kind of falls a little bit into sort of explaining it as well, I think. But rather than explaining why we're doing the exercise, I mean now in terms of like feedback during the exercise, and actually giving that time, whether it be one-to-one level or maybe reinforcing expectations during a practice as such. Those, but at interpersonal level, and not just about this is how you do the practice, but this is why I'm asking you to do that. And well, I like this here, but what's important is this stage. So sometimes time constraints get in the way of that, and that can sometimes, certainly what's interesting, I think, that around setting task expectations and ensuring that they're there, is when we talk about the need for competence, is about feeling that you can engage effectively with your environment. If we turn the volume down on that, then we're not really helping athletes feel a sense of competence or confidence as well to even engage with tasks, particularly more challenging tasks, those sorts of things. Versus, when we don't feel under time constraints. So I've noticed that a lot of coaches, they're less demanding of athletes, and so far as even they might still give instructions, and the structure and environment's fine, but the commands versus the asks might not be so salient in the former. Also, often because of having less time constraints, and it surrounds sometimes, again, obsession with activity itself. Maybe we're allowed a bit more leeway for like more informal conversations, either that we have with the athletes ourselves or maybe between athletes. I mean, all these things are really important for relatedness. So we really want to ensure that we're chatting to athletes and talking to them about things outside the sport, or even just within sport, but just, in that manner that we're giving each other time to just say hello and to check in on each other, those sorts of things. So what I would say to this is, I'm not dumb to the fact that we are always under time constraints. That's just, but that in itself, I think, is why I think that this conversation always goes back to your values as a coach then. Because the fact that we're always going to be under time constraints, because we never have endless amounts of time to work for an athlete or athletes in any given night or week or month, we need to choose how we spend that time, don't we? And what I would say there is, there's time pressures that we have innately, but there are also time pressures that we make. So we have the time pressure of knowing that we'd never have endless amounts of time, or there might be certain external factors, external pressures, where it be yeah, the booking limit you've got. Maybe, you're approaching kickoff in a match. Maybe it's the people around you because you can control yourself, but you can control how you act to other people, but not necessarily how other people act. So they are things, but come back to how do you respond to these external influences? That's the time pressures that you make or don't make, and I think that's where, as coaches, and this is to play devil's advocate once more, about maybe perhaps why we shouldn't then, give up too quickly on looking for opportunities to offer autonomy within sessions, or offer competent support in a really sort of vivid way, or offer relating this support, and really focus on the interpersonal side of coaching. Well, just don't try and fit in so much activity. If you've only got an hour, um, and you've got 6 exercises you get through, don't go through 6 exercises, go through 3. So is it, if it's the exercises that are stopping you from having the time and the peace of mind to actually work on the relationships with your athletes during the session, and focus on that. Focus your planning more around the progressions of a few exercises than the constant chop and changing of 6, 7, 8 exercises. So that is something we need to consider, and then really, can you also just really commit to increasing the value that you are offering for self-determination theory, and offering for what it teaches us about longer term motivation, and where that actually comes out of. Because this is the thing as well, and again, this is almost quoting verbatim, but I hear coaches talk about, well, we don't have time for that because we need to get in it, and it's separating still practice from interpersonal relationship. I mean, look, there was even research back, I think 2019, and it was some college, I think it was Josco in college, and it was with football coaches and football players rather, that found that autonomy supportive coaching actually increased the frequency of additional practice time in players across the season. So in terms of, practice away from training and just overall practice itself. And that's because we forget that pursuits towards mastery come often where people feel volitional in their actions to that end. And what I mean by that is that if you give players opportunities for independent thought, or opportunities for independent work, rather, is maybe a better way of phrasing this, as one of the activities, then they're taking ownership of that development, and therefore they're more engaged with it, and therefore they want to train harder and maybe more frequently as well. It's to your benefit. And again, it doesn't need to take over your whole coaching process. The technical skill development is part of it, but see the interpersonal practices of a coach as being instrumental towards the motivational perseverance of a player towards challenge, towards the technical skill practices, doing these things over and over. So they go together. It's not part of still practice, and it unlocks technical still practice. Even I had an interview that I done with Sophia Duet, looking at things around the coach-athlete relationship. That was a huge sort of anchor point, and it was certainly something that I've taken personally from Sophia's work, was a huge anchor point within it, is that it unlocks the interpersonal coaching, the relationship side of coaching, unlocks the skill in your athlete. So, for that reason. So not just that it helps them feel in a safer space that they can communicate, and maybe allow you to, through that, fashion a mode of working that unlocks their skill potential, but actually I think from more of a self-determination theory side of it, through the more internal drivers that are more sustaining of a player, that it unlocks in their pursuit towards excellence, and their continuous reaching towards being better, and their continuous sort of adherence to the training protocol. So that's the way I see it, because longer term, the more controlling mechanisms, they work short term, but across a longer space of time they aren't often as good. So I just say that to really counter that idea that this isn't part of trying to get your players better. Well, it is, because the motivational side is an underpinning mechanism for that pursuits. That's another thing just to think about, because it is again seen as, in a lot of ways, understandably so, and a lot of times that there really sometimes isn't, if there is a real clear bit of work that has to be done at the skill level, the technical level, the drill level, I don't know you want to call it that, of just really about where the cones are and what the exercises that we're doing, that you need to prioritise that. Fine, that is part of it as well sometimes, but in the main, I think everyone could be doing more to really counter the feeling of time constraints with actually what are you really caring more about, because that's what is going to be prioritize when you feel under time constraints, you know? And then there's a little bit of emotional intelligence in here as well, of not getting too removed from what you're trying to do because of external factors like that. That is something is, you know, and this is why it's important to understand your triggers. And the reason why I talk about influences on coach behavior is because I think as coaches, the more that we can understand the way that we what makes us tick and what makes us do this, and under what conditions do we act in this way, and versus and under what conditions do we act in this way. When you know the behaviors you want to show, knowing more about what makes you do more of that and what makes you do less of that is really important for consistency. So it's just if time constraints or something that stops you, or compels you to act in a way that you rather you didn't, then that's something you can target and work at and rehearse around. And part of emotional intelligence is about actually sort of like almost imagining and doing a bit of mental skills training, I think, as part of some maybe longer term work on yourself or maybe on your environment. It's sort of almost like preempting, this is going to happen, but I'm going to do this because of this, and that, and this part of my plan. And so I just mentioned that there as well. That I find quite interesting. The last one is, I think of all of them, is the most compelling case for coaches and coaches' behaviours to not be defined in binary codes, and not be seen as black and white, because it really, I'm talking now about the physical environment and the influence that can have on behaviour. Because come back to, yeah, there's the philosophical decision, there's the value of there's what we value and how that influences our decision, and that does always play hand in hand with the situation itself. But sometimes the situation itself overrides what we value, because it's about other just more pressing matters and more important factors at the base level of just keeping people safe, or in some ways where one need plays against another. Now, a lot of times the psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and lateness do help one another, but they still sit within situations. Sometimes a situation calls that the need for autonomy has to be, curbed, but we can still sustain some sort of need of competence or some sort of need of relatedness, and sometimes we do need to choose between them, or at least choose what's going to be the more salient element of our practice because of the situation. The examples I can give of this is, I've known coaches, for example, who believe that when it's like really bad weather conditions, it's not just that they feel a bit grumpy, or they just nobody likes to be coaching in the rain, but it's that they then appreciate that what the players need in the situations, because of the effect the weather has on them, is a counterbalance. So coaches I've worked with and observed, when who have worked in the community, for example, they've told me, you see, when it's snowing or it's raining, they're a bit more demanding of the players to keep moving, and they're a bit more agitated by a lack of tempo, and they'll not snap, but they'll be quicker to bite a little bit to keep players engaged in the practice. And it's not, and how they have spoken to me about it is that it's not been through ill intent. It's because the kids are cold and they need to keep them moving so they stay warm. And because the kids are distracted by the bad weather, they need to they need to sort of in name moments manufacture their engagement in the task to help them focus on the task and get the most out of that cold hour that they've got together. Otherwise, it's just a wasted time, and try and take their attention off of the wind or the rain and those sorts of things. So like, and that's funny because in some respects you might say, oh, but they're being more controlling because they're not allowing this, and that, or they're being a bit more bitey and this and that. But they're actually acting with the player's best intent in mind, because they're trying to look after them and show care for them. Other work, there's good studies, and a specific study as a case example of this was by Allen and Cooper in 2020, looking at adventure sports coaches who would actually, because of like poor water conditions, deliberately impose a more controlling stance on the clients that they're working with, the people that are out in the river, because it's safety. If they just do, no matter what, even if they really value autonomy support, if they just, even when the water conditions are really poor, they say to them, yeah, go and do this, and you can have a bit of flexibility here. That could be dangerous, and people could get hurt. So that's, as I say, sometimes the situation overrides the value, but does it need to override? This is what I mean. And it may require us to, we can still make it that the situation requires to choose between needs and not choose no needs support. So what I mean by that is the player's experience always trumps a coach's intention. So even well, as I've given examples here of coaches making decisions for reasons that are completely legitimate and completely not just logistical, but framed within a situation that they understand is it's really required. There is no wiggle room there. We can still, using soft behaviours, communicate the reasons behind their actions, and that's called as like a soft autonomy supported behaviour. So where I can't allow you to do something because of X, Y, and Z, or the reason I'm doing something, then this is again, I'll keep it within the example here of the physical environment. But it does still, this is a general point I think happens across any kind of situation, not just the physical environment. But by me explaining, look, it's really cold, we need to stay warm. That's why I'm going to keep saying this, guys, and it's because I want to make sure you don't get cold. It actually is making sure it's an overt communication of what you're doing so that it doesn't perhaps become lost. The message doesn't become lost in the way the players are experiencing that behaviour because they might not, and not knowing why you're doing it, they can misinterpret it and it's off is innately how they experience it, is how the behaviour is lived and it's is experienced and how it's, yeah, and the effect it has. So it won't matter your intent in those situations. So that's how you can save it a little bit. You still need to, and it's the coach's prerogative to be controlling in the right situations. But can we use soft autonomy support behaviours to manage that? Just kind of going back to just the wider idea that the physical environment actually changes our approach to coaching. I think a mediator in that is how it affects our own behaviours. A mediator in that is the way it affects our mood and our emotions. And again, this won't ever happen in a vacuum. It can compound, poor weather, coaching in poor weather can compound the experience of coaching under pressure, so that, as I say, antecedents don't operate in a vacuum either. So they interact with one another. Again, as coaches, I would just ask you and urge you to reflect on when you've been coaching in the sun, how does it feel? Okay, let's just think in isolation just now, but do you tend to find that you feel happier? Do you tend to find that, or when you're coaching outdoors, or when you're coaching, do you tend to find that it makes you a bit looser maybe and more likely to chat about certain things or to allow certain things to slide? Or how does how does that interact with your working day that you've had, or how does that interact with other pressures or other things going on in there? So, we all know that we feel better sometimes in good weather and not so good in other weather, but it's just something to put out there. So the physical environment is acting on you, even the weather is acting on you as a coach. And um, perhaps for coaches that do operate in colder countries, and there hasn't been a lot of research specifically in coaching spheres to look at this, but I think certainly at that greater effect or lesser feelings of affect, there's certainly, there's tangible traces of that in wider research and within psychology. So in terms of how it affects mood and behaviour, so it's just something to think about. I think that's a more interesting one, and it really does just go to the core of this understanding that you are not just you. You are the product of the past you, of the environment that you're in, and all these variables interacting with one another. And therefore that kind of goes into why I always say that we need to know more about ourselves and understand more about our triggers, understand about our environment and our typical environment, and how our typical environment sways us towards certain behaviours so that we can act back against that where we need to. Just a few things to kind of work through there. I hope some of that was interesting to you. This is only some of many practical challenges that coaches are up against that can influence the way we act. I've just put out there, if you've got other ones that you think you would like to even share with us, you comment on this episode wherever you're listening, or get in touch with me at labours-of-sports-coaching@mail.com. Give us some feedback, those sorts of things. Share on social media if you like, and get other people involved in that conversation. I would love that. And yeah, of course, stay tuned for next week because we'll go into some further ones. So now that we've kind of struck off the use and role of competition as a training modality, as a practical consideration, and also now time constraints, and also now sort of like the idea of the sensibility of certain activities, activity type, and also now the physical environment and all those sorts of things have now came into play here now in our conversation. So let's see if there's some more that we can delve into next week. Hopefully you enjoyed that, guys, and yeah, no more to say. Thank you. I will see you next time.